The local Maoris say the first man to set foot in New Zealand arrived here at Hokianga in Northland. The name of that first explorer was Kupe. He stepped ashore 1,000 years ago. 70 years later, he sailed back to his home in the Pacific, Hawaii, to report his discovery. And 400 years after that, in about 1350, a great fleet sailed from Hawaii to colonize the land Kupe had found. That, or something like it, depending on which tribe is telling the story, is the Maori legend. It's also become the accepted New Zealand tradition. But scientists are now providing overwhelming evidence to show that no matter how intriguing a story it might be, it's nothing more, in fact, than legend.
Lot 131. The Maori preserved head.
But it's a compelling story. For generations, it's been the version of history that New Zealanders have accepted, and so has the rest of the world.
£1,000 is bid. £1,000. £1,000. Any more?
Tales of noble Polynesian savages captured the imagination of 19th century Europe. Before long, a grisly export trade in curios had developed.
£1,600. Any more? 1,700.
At auction rooms in London, at Christie's and Sotheby's, they still fetch fancy prices.
2,400, 2,600, 2,800, 3,000.
There was and still is a brisk trade in Maori weapons, tools and carvings. Over the past 100 years, New Zealand's heritage has been scattered around the world.
4,200, 4,500.
Recently, at auctions like this, New Zealand has started to buy it back.
5,500. 6,000. £6,000. Any more?
Although the price of the artifacts goes up year by year, they are in fact of limited value in interpreting the past.
6,000. Any more? Schreiber?
The really valuable evidence about the first people in New Zealand is still buried in dust and dirt, much closer to home. In central Otago, archaeology students sift through the traces left by a tribe of Stone Age hunters. This dig is at Hawksburn. So far, it's one of the very few campsites discovered away from the coast.
No, because it's under.
From the fragments left behind, the archaeologists can tell who these people were, how they lived, and what they hunted. Almost everything we learn about early New Zealand contradicts the traditional stories and legends. Yet the myths are still firmly believed. To discover why, we need to look back to the year 1840. For most Pākehā New Zealanders, their history starts with the treaty signed here at Waitangi. Every year, Pākehā and Maori commemorate what happened here in 1840 when the Maori chiefs put their marks on the white man's treaty. The Maori no more understood that treaty than the white man understood the alien culture he'd encountered. To that first ceremony in the Bay of Islands, the Europeans brought their pomp and their pieces of paper. The Maori had no written language. Their culture depended largely on word of mouth. They used songs and dances to pass on their traditions and their legends. The Pākehā did his best to interpret what he heard and to understand the Maori's other way of recording the past, his intricate carvings. The meeting house at Waitangi contains some of the best examples of the way the Maoris etched the story of their people in wood. To the Maoris, these carvings were eloquent. They still are. In the land they called Aotearoa, this form of Polynesian art reached its peak. Each carving had a basis in tribal tradition. But as the carvers became more skillful and evolved new forms, so the stories became more embroidered and more fanciful. Often, even Maori elders no longer know the precise meaning of these carved posts. Yet in 1840, with no written records, these carvings, along with the legends and genealogies, were all the Europeans had to go on as they tried to unravel the past. Perhaps it's not surprising that they got the story wrong. Every legend, though, contains a germ of truth. One was the story of a magic mountain near East Cape called Hikurangi, the first place in the world to be struck by the light of a new day. On it, the Maoris said, was a special secret place, a cave where a giant creature lived, guarded by a pair of tuatara lizards. It sounded rather like a tall story, but then, not far from Hikurangi, a trader was handed a fragment of an enormous bone. The Maoris had told the trader that it was the bone of a bird of flight. And here's that very bone. It was brought all the way here to London from the flanks of Hikurangi before the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. But at first nobody wanted to know about it, not even Professor Richard Owen, perhaps the most eminent anatomist of his time, a colleague of Charles Darwin. He scoffed at the bone. He said it was far too heavy to be the bone of a bird that flew. But he was persuaded to take a second look at it, and it was then that his curiosity was aroused. He found that it couldn't be the bone of a mammal, nor the bone of a reptile, and if it wasn't the bone of a bird that flew, it must be the bone of a flightless bird. So Owen decided to stick his neck out. He exhibited the bone here at the Zoological Society of London, and in a report to the Society, he risked his very considerable scientific reputation on the basis of a mere 10 centimeters of broken bone fragment. He declared it to be the bone of a flightless bird and the bone of a bird larger than any known to science. He christened it Dinornis, but it was to become known in New Zealand as the Moa. Owen had identified a fragment from the thigh bone of a Moa, but he'd little idea what a complete skeleton would look like. When other bones arrived from New Zealand, he put them together to show what a monster Dinornis maximus must have been. At the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, the skeleton of the giant wingless bird went on permanent display. Owen went on to become the museum's first director. But he never forgot the excitement that followed his pronouncements about the moa. It's no wonder that the statue they erected in his honor has him holding a complete thigh bone of a moa, even a little larger than the real thing. But back in New Zealand, men had a country to break in and a living to make. At Glenmark in North Canterbury, a run holder called George Moore was developing a sheep station in the tussock grassland. It was good land. The only drawback was the swamp alongside the place where he wanted to build his homestead. Moore realized that if he drained the swamp, it would provide the richest part of his whole property. So he set a gang of men to work digging ditches through the swamp, but it wasn't long before they were complaining bitterly. The problem was bones, big bones, bones by the thousand. There's still some bones about in this corner of the swamp that hasn't been drained yet. The workmen at the time had difficulty in places in even getting their spades into the ground, and it was obvious to Moore that he couldn't possibly have lost as many bullocks as that. He thought he'd better get in touch with somebody in Christchurch about it, so he called in the provincial geologist, Julius Haast, and Haast knew immediately what the bones were. Haast, a scientist from Germany, realized that Glenmark was the graveyard of perhaps 1,000 moas. This was only the first of a succession of similar finds. But the most important came much later and was only 10 kilometers away from Glenmark at Pyramid Valley. The valley was excavated in the early 1940s, and again, hundreds of moas were buried there. But this time there was a difference. In the Pyramid Valley swamp, the moa skeletons were intact and upright. The moas had stumbled into the swamp and died standing up. Here, it was easy to reassemble the skeletons. But at that first discovery at Glenmark, Julius Haast had had no such luck. Here, the bones were a chaotic jumble. Haast had to work out each skeleton for himself. He fitted the bones together in the provincial council chambers in Christchurch. Museums all around the world were anxious to acquire their own skeletons of this monstrous bird. So Haast sent them wherever he could get valuable exhibits in exchange. This system of barter laid the foundation of the early collection of the Canterbury Museum. Julius Haast was not only the founder of the museum, but he became its first director. His reputation spread widely, and he was honored in London and Vienna. But the reputation of Sir Julius Ritter von Haast, Fellow of the Royal Society, was based on his work as a geologist. His studies of the moa were often sadly astray. Haast believed that because the Maoris knew nothing of the moa, the skeletons at Glenmark must be tens or even hundreds of thousands of years old and as ancient as the dinosaurs. When discoveries at river mouths in Canterbury showed that man and moa had lived at the same time, Haast still wasn't too concerned. He came up with a new theory. He argued that the people who hunted the moas must have been an ancient people here long, long before the Maoris. But Haast found it very difficult to explain the evidence that he himself was to unearth right on his own doorstep at Redcliffs near Sumner. Since the 1850s, the road from Lyttelton to Christchurch has run past the entrance to a cave. In 1872, Haas began excavating the floor of the cave with a young assistant called Mackay. But digging beneath the floor of this cave, Alexander Mackay found something that was to completely shatter Haast's theory. A polished stone tool. And as far as we know, no such polished stone tools in New Zealand are more than 1,000 years old. This, though, was found in association with Moa bones and with distinctively Moa hunter tools and ornaments, so that the Moa couldn't possibly have become extinct all those thousands of years ago. Poor Haast, so serious and rather pompous, was now hopelessly confused and embarrassed, and in no hurry, no special hurry anyway, to tell the world all about it. But other people were. When Mackay walked out of the cave, he didn't realize the full significance of his find. He was probably thinking more about the new job he was shortly to take up in Wellington at the Colonial Museum. There, his new employer was James Hector, a geologist like Haast and also a rival, jealous of the German scientist's success. 2 years later, Hector presented a paper supposedly written by young Mackay, giving a full account of the discoveries at Sumner. Imagine Haast's dismay when he saw his theories about the Moa hunters demolished by the results of his own research, published under the name of his former assistant. The bitter dispute that developed raged for years. "50 years later, there was a much more important find. This time, there could be no argument. It happened on the Wairau Bar, a narrow bank of boulders that reaches 10 kilometers out into Cloudy Bay on the Marlborough coast, just across from Wellington. This time, the discovery was made by a schoolboy, Jim Isles, who lived with his parents at the very tip of the bar. Jim's father eked out an existence as a part-time fisherman, part-time farmer. During the Depression years, it was a bleak existence and a lonely one. To pass the time, Jim used to fossick for the stone tools that kept on turning up on the farm. In 1939, and I remember quite well the stir it caused at the time because I'd just arrived in New Zealand myself, Jim dug into a bank and his spade struck something that seemed hollow. He thought he'd found the empty shell of a gourd or a pumpkin such as the Maoris used to carry water in, but he hadn't. He'd found something very much more exciting than that. It was the egg of a moa, almost as big as a man's head. And over the next few years, people throughout New Zealand were to read of Jim Isles' discoveries. But the really big moment for the schoolboy from the Wairau Bar came 3 years later in 1942. 40 years on, Jim Isles still remembers every detail.
There was much Maori shell in the midden, but below this eggshell there were quite a number of brown bones which proved to be human.
What Jim Isles had found was the most important archaeological discovery ever made in New Zealand. It was the grave of a young chief. The design of his ornaments and the shape of his adzes pointed unmistakably to the origins of his culture, the islands of eastern Polynesia. But the artifacts weren't brought here. They were made in New Zealand from local stone and moa bones. Also buried with the chief was a moa's egg with a drill hole in one end of it, a vessel for carrying water. This and other evidence showed that these people from eastern Polynesia had found the moa the most important of all their resources. Altogether, about 40 graves were excavated on the Wairau Bar. They tell the story of a community of tall, well-built Polynesians. The end of the Wairau Bar was the perfect spot for catching moas. They probably chased them onto the boulder bank and drove them towards the far end. There was no escape, and the birds were slaughtered, cut up and consumed where the moa hunters built their village. People from the Eastern Pacific had not only lived in New Zealand alongside the moa, but in many places they'd come to depend on it. They used its flesh for food, its eggshells for carrying water, its skin for clothing, and its bone for making tools and ornaments, and all this very, very many years before the Great Fleet reached Aotearoa. The men who hunted the moa in New Zealand found it very different from the tropical islands they'd left behind. There were very few of them, of course, but they very skillfully adapted their Eastern Polynesian culture to cope with a chillier and more hostile environment. What a change it was from the tropics. In Eastern Polynesia, you can still get a pretty good idea of the life the first New Zealanders left behind. The coconut palm provides almost all the food and shelter you need. The warm waters surrounding every island were teeming with deep water fish, tuna and bonito. Sheltered by coral reefs were the lagoons, home of schools of smaller fish. With everything you'd need so handy, this was the original South Sea Island paradise. Who would decide to abandon this for the chilly coasts of Otago in winter? But I don't think those first New Zealanders did any such thing. I believe they ended up in Aotearoa by accident. The only way of leaving their island was by canoe, in its crudest form, hardly more than a hollowed-out log. They used such canoes almost every day for sailing just outside the reef. Occasionally, they'd take their bigger outriggers to visit the nearest inhabited island, usually little more than a day's paddling away. Beyond the reef, though, there was always the danger of a tropical storm blowing their canoes off course. Even such experienced navigators as the Polynesians would have had no choice but to ride before the storm at the mercy of wind and waves. After the storm, they wouldn't know where they were. Sometimes they might strike land, but more often they didn't and were lost at sea. In 1955, I counted myself very lucky not to have shared a similar fate. I was supposed to sail on a little inter-island trading vessel called the Joyita, but so many government officials were sailing that day that I was offloaded. I was quite annoyed about it at the time, but little did I realize what an amazing piece of good fortune it was. The Joyita was headed for disaster. Let's call this the equator. These shells can be Fiji, the Tokelau's and Samoa. The Joyita was sailing north from western Samoa to the Tokelau's. Somewhere on the way, the Joyita just vanished without trace. When it did turn up 6 weeks later, there wasn't a soul aboard and not a scrap of gear or cargo. It was just a drifting shell, and it was 1,300 kilometers off course, away to the west, just north of Vanuatu in Fiji.
I remember there were all kinds of theories about what had happened to the Joyita. Everything from an attack by Japanese pirates to visitors from outer space. I suppose, though, we'll never really know what happened. Yet we can explain why the Joyita was so far off course.
In the latitude of the Tropic of Capricorn, everything drifts from east to west. Further south, though, in the latitude of New Zealand, the winds blow from west to east. That's why so much of our weather comes to us from off the Tasman.
I'm convinced that this helps to explain how man first reached New Zealand. Just imagine what would happen to a canoe blown off course and lost in the vicinity of, say, the Tuamotus or Marquesas, or the Cook Islands, or the Society Islands.
Wherever it was, the canoe, like the Joyita, would be at the mercy of the prevailing easterlies. If the canoe got as far as, say, Fiji, and was also far enough south, it would be caught up in those variable westerlies and could very easily come ashore in New Zealand.
So I'm convinced that the ancestors of the people who lived on the Wairau Bar left the tropics quite unintentionally and came upon New Zealand by accident. In that case, the first man and woman to tread New Zealand soil were the last starving survivors of an epic journey they'd never intended to make.
Even the legends of the Great Fleet admit they were lucky to make it. The legends assume the new arrivals planned their voyage and carried proper supplies, and yet the Victorian painters reduced them to skin and bone. I wonder what the same artists would have made of a man and woman who arrived out of the blue in a simple outrigger canoe.
But no matter how they got here or where they came ashore, they'd be weak with thirst and hunger. But they probably found their first meal before they reached high water mark, because the rocks were covered with oysters and mussels and sea eggs, and in the sand itself there were pipi and toiroa and paua and other shellfish. But perhaps the most remarkable thing of all about the new and relatively chilly land they'd reached was its endless forests and its countless birds.
What a strange encounter it must have been. A handful of castaways arriving exhausted in a virgin land, finding only birds and insects, mountains and forests. There is, of course, no written record of how they came to terms with their newfound land. But there is a record of sorts buried in the ground. What visitor from abroad would think of going to the city rubbish dump to see how New Zealanders live today? Yet, if we care to look, this tip can tell us a great deal. Somewhere here, you'll find evidence of just about everything we eat, everything we wear, and everything we use. The refuse that was dumped first is at the bottom. Every day a new layer is piled on top, burying the older material deeper and deeper. The first New Zealanders had rubbish tips too. Their middens were alongside their campsites, near their ovens and eating places. More often than not, the leftovers were the shells of pipis and cockles. The shells tell us that those first people settled near the sea that had brought them here. This midden at Punawea in the South Island is one of a string of middens along the bleak northern shore of Fovo Strait. It was far too near Antarctica to be paradise, but for a people determined to survive, there was food and shelter enough. Middens are often destroyed by the wind and sea or by holidaymakers on the beach. But the one at Punawea, like the grave of the chief on the Wairau Bar, has been carefully reconstructed. The model's now in the Otago Museum. It's obvious from such rubbish tips that several species of moa were plentiful and were being eaten in the south, at least 2 centuries before the great fleets supposed to have arrived in the north. The evidence is there. The bones and the black layers of moa fat and charcoal at the bottom of the midden. By 1450, there's much less moa grease and fewer moa bones. By 1660, there's almost no trace of the moa. Now, the hunters are living on fish, shellfish, and small birds. Only a century later, the moa hunters themselves have vanished from the area. The forest has started to reclaim the campsite. This Punawea evidence was first interpreted in the 1950s when the science of carbon dating was new to New Zealand. Carbon dating is a bit of atomic age magic that I've never really understood, but it enables scientists to pinpoint the dates of events that occurred hundreds of years ago. At the Nuclear Sciences Laboratory in Wellington, scientists feed pieces of bone, shell, and charcoal into the carbon dating chain. And carbon dating has shown that the moa was still around in the 17th century, probably even later. That in itself is quite staggering. But the same techniques have fixed the date of an event which I believe has had far more impact on New Zealand than the extinction of the moa. I'm talking about the complete transformation of the landscape of the South Island.
When the first settlers penetrated inland as far as central Otago, they found logs like this in the tussock all over the place. And they came in handy too. The run holders split them to make fencing materials, and when the gold miners were here, they used them to light fires to boil the billy on and to keep themselves warm outside on bitterly cold and frosty nights. But though the early settlers weren't slow to find uses for these logs, what nobody realized at that time was that they contained the key to the history of this land and of its very first people.
They're totara logs, remnants of vast forests that once reached all the way from here in central Otago north to Cook Strait. This ancient seed tree was growing at least 700 years ago. Today, totara saplings are starting to cluster around this age-old survivor. But what happened to all the other trees of the original forest? Carbon dating of the logs has given us the clue. The original totara forest here was killed by fire 600 or 700 years ago. And I believe the fires were lit by men who hunted the moas, either by accident or by design. Though I think they deliberately used fire as a hunting device. It may all have started by accident when a fire got away on them, and they were astute enough to realize that the raging fire flushed the moas out of the forest, and that the moas themselves came back afterwards in larger numbers to graze the fresh grass and shrubs that sprang up. Those fires must have been fantastic, 1,000 times fiercer than any scrub fire we see today. The conflagrations raged over millions of hectares of forest, off and on throughout the years from 1100 to 1300 AD. Once the virgin forest had gone, it would have taken only occasional accidental fires in the tussock and scrub to stop it coming back. Today, you have to get permission to light fires, and the totara is making a comeback. So it was the moa hunters who destroyed the totara forests and created the tussock grassland. And in the process, they also exterminated 20 species of moa and 40 species of other birds, swans and eagles and geese. But most important of all, they undermined the very basis of their own distinctive way of life. Once the forests had gone, the soil and loose rock began to go too. It was the moa hunters' fires 700 years ago that probably set this shingle slide in motion. Once the erosion started, there was nothing to stop it. But the moa hunters paid the price for treating the land so harshly. And these bare slopes are their memorial. But in the North Island, another culture was flourishing. These people were more numerous, and they had time for carving and decoration, for music and song. They had time too for war, and they were cannibals. Their culture has largely survived. But what made the classical Maori culture so successful? More than anything else, it was probably the kumara. Wherever soil and climate allowed, the Maori grew kumara. He still does. This sweet potato was Aotearoa's convenience food. The kumara made the difference between a people who had to hunt and gather food all over the place and one able to stay near the village, growing and storing crops close to hearth and home. Ahu Ahu is the name the Maoris gave to an island off the Coromandel coast. Today, we call it Great Mercury Island. Here may lie the clue as to how the Coomera came to New Zealand and when.
There are middens on this island that show that both Moas and men were eaten here. What's more, there's evidence to suggest that Coomeras were cultivated here when the Moa was still available. And that's quite fascinating, because this could well be where Maori culture, so often based on agriculture, really got its start.
Piles of stones are arranged in straight lines all over the island. But who put them there and why? I believe the stones may well have been collected together to protect the first plantings of crops brought to New Zealand. Those early gardeners probably chose an island like this, free from frosts and surrounded by warm ocean. But the terrain is so broken and rocky that before they could plant, the Polynesians would have had to clear the boulders to one side. The result was a series of stony windbreaks and an environment in which the Coomera they'd brought from the Pacific could be adapted to New Zealand conditions.
A century or two before Europeans reached New Zealand, the Polynesians were already very skillful gardeners, particularly in the North Island. And the gardeners of Ahu Ahu probably supplied the mainland with Coomera seed and taro tops for planting.
Swamp plants now grow in the pits they dug to store Coomera. With the harvest safely stored away, there was time to spare, time to develop and enjoy the skills of combat. What a grandstand view they'd have had from here of any challenger who dared to approach. Every hilltop was a potential fortress. The higher and steeper, the better. The role this island played in Maori culture can of course only be guessed at. But what we know for sure is that it was on the mainland, especially around the volcanoes of North Auckland, that classical Maori culture really took off. The district between Kaikohe and the Bay of Islands is dotted with volcanic cones. They were ideal sites for pa, perfect defensive sites. But the Maori went even further, carving tiers of terraces in the flanks of extinct volcanoes. They remain the Maori's most lasting landmark. War was a game that everybody played. The intricate skills of wood carving were practiced only by the few. Master carvers whose distinctive work recorded each tribe's identity in wood. The ancient greenstone chisels, rarely seen today outside museums, still make light work of the native timbers. But like war, carving was something made possible by the leisure time that became available once the Coomera and other crops were cultivated. The tribes could afford to support specialists. Carving, tattooing, and songs in the meeting house, all these handed on each tribe's traditions from one generation to the next. Part of those traditions was tapu, a system of stern rules that govern tribal life. Upon those rules depended the conservation of the Maori's most important resources: fish, forests and birds. And of course, the successful cultivation of the kumara. Today's generations of New Zealanders have no time for such restrictions. Polynesians live in a European setting with their traditions a faint memory. They're as eager as anyone to earn and to spend. The transformation has been dramatic, but the story of Polynesian New Zealand is far from over.
Air New Zealand announced the departure of Flight T3 to Auckland.
They're still leaving their island homes for New Zealand. The passengers in a single jet from Rarotonga probably outnumber all the adventurers who sailed in any fleet of canoes. Most of them head for Auckland, the largest Polynesian city in the world. All that the first arrivals had to contend with was nature. Nowadays, they have to cope with the white man's alien culture. But the Polynesians who live in Aotearoa have a very long history of change. They're used to adapting to new conditions. Facing the city of Auckland, out in the Hauraki Gulf, sits the island of Motutapu. The history of the people who lived there tells virtually the whole story of Polynesian New Zealand.
The Polynesian explorer Kupe is said to have reached New Zealand 1,000 years ago. But now we know that people firmly occupied Aotearoa by then. And like us, those who lived on Motutapu, on Auckland's doorstep, probably thought their way of life was pretty permanent. They were moa hunters, but they were to see tremendous social and physical upheavals. The loss of the moa, the development of agriculture, prolonged intertribal warfare. And the most obvious physical upheaval was the birth of Rangitoto. It erupted from beneath the sea 700 years ago. Showers of ash buried the moa hunters' encampments on Motutapu and destroyed their way of life. I wonder whether our own society is really any more permanent than theirs was. It's already changing fast, and already one thing's certain. New Zealand population and society will become more and more Polynesian in flavour.